An entire city on the brink of collapse, rioters running wild, and a man forced to make a deadly choice. Can they stop the chaos before it destroys everything? What happens when the lines between survival and betrayal blur? Stay with us till the end to uncover the shocking truth behind the deadly riots that plunged England into anarchy. This hook aims to intrigue your viewers with a glimpse of suspense, offering them a reason to stay till the end to find out how the story unfolds. The air was thick, suffocating. The streets of London, once vibrant, now eerie. A shadow hung over the city. Windows shattered. A distant scream pierced the silence. Mark stood in the middle of the road. His heart pounded. His breath was shallow. The chaos around him was relentless. People ran, stumbling over broken glass, desperate to escape or join the madness. The distant sound of sirens could barely be heard. It was drowned by the roar of the angry crowd. Fires burned in the distance. Red and orange flickers painted the darkening sky. Mark's shoes stuck to the wet ground. The smell of smoke, rubber, and something else. Something metallic clung to the air. He turned, eyes wide. A group of masked figures moved towards him, their eyes wild, faces hidden. The tension in the air was palpable. He froze. The only sound was the pounding of his own heartbeat. Time slowed. The crowd seemed to blur, voices muffled. The only thing he could hear was the slow, deliberate steps approaching him. Then it happened. A sharp crack. A bottle shattered near his feet. A woman screamed. It felt like the world had ruptured. He stumbled back, barely escaping the spray of glass. His mind raced. The world was on fire, but he was caught in the middle. The streets were a battlefield now. Men and women screamed, fighting with everything they had. It was pure chaos. He could hear the gasping breath of the man beside him. Their eyes met. Fear was the only language they shared. Mark tried to move, but his legs were frozen. He was paralyzed by the madness. The world around him had become unrecognizable. Each step, each movement was a gamble. Would he make it through? Would he survive the night? The air was thick with the scent of blood, and the sky above seemed to close in. Mark didn't know how much longer he could stand it. A noise broke through. A loud crack of thunder, followed by the screech of tires. A car barreled past, tires spinning out of control. It skidded to a halt right in front of him. The doors slammed open. A figure stepped out. It was all happening so fast. Mark was still frozen. His body ached, his muscles begging for movement. But he couldn't. He couldn't run. Not yet. The figure from the car was coming toward him. Mark's throat was dry. He couldn't see the person's face, just a dark silhouette. But something in the way they moved, the quickness of their steps, told him this was no ordinary stranger. His instinct screamed, "Run!" But his body wouldn't obey. The figure stopped just a few feet away. The air was heavy, thick with tension. Mark could hear every shallow breath he took. "Are you alone?" The voice cracked through the chaos. Mark nodded. "Barely." "Get in," the figure ordered, his voice firm. Mark didn't hesitate. He couldn't. He stumbled into the car, the door slamming shut behind him. The vehicle peeled away. The wheels screamed against the wet pavement, and the noise of the riot began to fade into the background. But the sense of danger didn't leave. The car moved quickly, swerving through the streets, avoiding wreckage and barricades. It was like the city itself had been torn apart. The figure beside him remained silent. Mark's gaze never left the rear-view mirror. He expected to see the riot, people chasing after them, fury in their eyes. But all he saw was the night swallowing them whole. As they sped through alleyways and back streets, the world outside was a blur. It was like they were in a different universe, untouched by the chaos. The figure's hands gripped the wheel tightly. The tension in the air was suffocating. But Mark didn't dare speak. Where were they going? Who was this person? The questions twisted in his mind, but the words never left his lips. They passed through a narrow bridge, and the car slowed, finally coming to a stop. The figure turned to him, their face still hidden in shadow. "Stay quiet," they said, voice low. Mark nodded, his heart pounding louder than ever before. He didn't know if he could trust them, but right now, he had no choice. The figure opened the door, gesturing for Mark to follow. Without a word, Mark stepped out onto the cold ground. The chill of the night air hit him like a slap. The streets were empty, here silent. The building in front of him was old, its windows boarded up. It looked abandoned, forgotten by the world. Inside, the figure instructed, their voice still firm, but with an edge of urgency. Mark hesitated for a moment, but the pounding of distant explosions in the background urged him forward. He stepped inside, the door creaking shut behind him. The room was dimly lit, the walls cracked and decaying. A faint odor of mildew hung in the air. It was as if time had stopped here, like no one had set foot in this place for years. The figure moved to the center of the room, flicking a switch. A low hum filled the space, and suddenly, a few light bulbs overhead flickered to life. Mark blinked, trying to adjust his eyes to the weak light. The place felt wrong. He could sense something that made his skin crawl. The figure turned toward him. Finally, they spoke again. "We're not safe here." Their words were blunt, cold. Mark's chest tightened. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice cracking. The figure's gaze shifted to the floor. "There's nowhere left to hide. The city's gone mad. It's spreading everywhere." Mark could feel the weight of their words. It was like a punch to the gut. "We're caught in the middle of something bigger," the figure continued. "The riots aren't just random. It's organized. And it's spreading faster than anyone realizes." Mark's head was spinning. What was happening? What was this person talking about? Before he could ask another question, a noise came from the shadows behind them. A soft shuffle. Mark froze. The air thickened once again. It was too late to back out now. The shuffle grew louder, echoing off the walls. Mark's pulse quickened. His eyes darted around the room. Something wasn't right. The figure moved toward the noise, their movement sharp and calculated. Mark could barely make out the outline of another person, a shape emerging from the shadows. His breath caught in his throat. This person looked wrong. They were hunched, their eyes wide and unblinking, filled with a manic intensity. The figure who had brought Mark here raised a hand, motioning for him to stay back. "Stay calm," they whispered, but their voice trembled. Mark's body tensed, a cold sweat trickling down his neck. The person in the shadows took another step forward, and Mark could now see their face twisted in a grotesque grin. This wasn't just a stranger. This wasn't just someone caught in the riot. This was something more. The figure beside Mark stepped closer to the person in the shadows, their eyes flickering with a mixture of fear and caution. "Not yet," they muttered under their breath. Mark had no idea what was happening, but the air in the room felt suffocating. It was thick with something primal, something terrifying. The figure reached into their coat, slowly pulling out something small and metallic. A gun. Mark's heart skipped a beat. What were they going to do? Who were these people? Without warning, the person in the shadows lunged. Their movements were jerky, unpredictable. The figure fired. The sound of the shot was deafening in the cramped room. Mark flinched, his heart racing as the person in the shadows dropped to the floor. It all happened so fast. For a moment, the room was still. The only sound was the ragged breathing of Mark and the figure. Then the figure turned to Mark, their face now visible in the dim light. "Get ready," they said, voice low, as they began moving toward the door. Mark's legs were like lead, but he followed. There was no other choice. The air was growing heavier by the second. The world outside was closing in. And, in that moment, Mark realized the true terror had only just begun. They reached the door, and the figure paused, hand on the handle. Mark could feel his chest tighten again. Something wasn't right. The air was too still, too quiet. Every instinct screamed at him to run. The figure turned, their eyes meeting Mark's. "Stay close," they whispered, their voice suddenly full of urgency. Before Mark could respond, the door swung open, and the sound of distant shouting flooded in. The chaos outside had grown louder, more frantic. It was no longer just a riot. It was something else, something darker. The figure motioned for Mark to follow, stepping cautiously into the hallway. It was narrow, lined with peeling wallpaper and old, rusted pipes. As they moved down the hallway, Mark's senses were on edge. His every step seemed to echo, and each creak of the floor beneath him sent a jolt through his body. Then they stopped. A door at the end of the hall stood ajar, light spilling out. The figure glanced at Mark, nodding toward it. "Stay low," they murmured. Mark nodded quickly, his hands trembling at his sides. They crept forward, slow and deliberate. The air felt suffocating, but the sense of urgency was overpowering. They reached the door. The figure peeked inside, then quickly pulled Mark in after them. The room was a small, dimly lit office. A desk sat against one wall, papers scattered across it. A single light bulb flickered overhead. The figure went straight to the desk, rifling through the papers. Mark didn't move. His eyes kept darting to the door, to the window, to the shadows. It was as if the walls were closing in. The world outside felt like it was getting closer, pressing in on him from every side. Then the figure turned, holding a folder. "This is why they're rioting," they said, their voice steady despite the chaos outside. Mark couldn't breathe. What was in that folder? What was happening to the city? But before he could ask, the sound of footsteps approaching made both of them freeze. The figure looked at Mark. "Get under the desk," they whispered, eyes wide with urgency. Mark didn't think twice. He dove under the desk, his heart pounding in his ears. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Mark held his breath, wondering if they would make it out of this. The footsteps halted just outside the door. Mark's pulse thudded in his temples. His body was frozen, pressed against the cold floor beneath the desk. The door creaked open, slowly, deliberately. Mark's breath was shallow. He could feel his chest tightening with every passing second. The figure across the room stood still, waiting, silent. The intruders stepped inside. Mark's eyes could barely see them through the gap under the desk. A shadow moved in the doorway, a figure dressed in dark clothes, mask covering their face. They scanned the room. Mark's body screamed for him to move, but he stayed perfectly still. The seconds felt like hours. The figure by the desk didn't flinch, didn't make a sound. Finally, the intruders spoke. "Nothing here," they muttered, their voice low and almost bored. Mark felt his heart slow just a fraction. The figure by the desk shifted. For a moment, Mark thought they might give them away, but instead, the intruder turned, stepping out of the room. The door slammed shut behind them. Mark let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. The figure by the desk turned to him, motioning for him to stay down. They waited, listening. The silence stretched on, broken only by the faint sounds of the riot outside. After what felt like an eternity, the figure finally stood, walking quietly to the door. Mark slowly rose from under the desk, his limbs stiff from staying still for so long. The figure looked back at him, nodding once. "We need to move now," they whispered. Mark nodded, his mind racing. They hurried out of the office, moving through the dim hallway once again. The air still felt thick, heavy with danger. They reached the stairs, the figure taking the lead, Mark close behind. But as they reached the ground floor, a loud crash echoed through the building, followed by shouting. Mark's eyes widened. "They've found us," the figure said, voice tight with fear. Before Mark could react, the sound of shuffling footsteps grew nearer. There was no time left. The figure grabbed Mark's arm, yanking him toward the nearest exit. They burst through a side door, into a narrow alley. The cold night air hit them like a slap. Mark stumbled, barely catching his balance as they sprinted down the alley. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit were growing louder. Mark could hear footsteps, shouts, crashing of trash cans. His heart raced, but the figure kept pulling him forward. "Keep moving," the figure urged, their grip unyielding. The alley twisted, narrower now, winding between buildings. Mark glanced over his shoulder. Two dark figures appeared at the mouth of the alley, chasing them. The figure beside Mark didn't slow. They veered left, into another alley, cutting through the city like they knew every corner, every hiding place. Mark struggled to keep up. His breath came in ragged gasps, his legs burning. They were getting closer. The sound of their footsteps was unmistakable. Mark could feel the tension in the air, the undeniable certainty that they wouldn't outrun them forever. He glanced at the figure beside him, desperation in their eyes, their face strained with fear. Finally, the figure turned a sharp corner, leading Mark into a small courtyard. They skidded to a halt behind a large dumpster, the sound of heavy breathing filling the air. Mark crouched low, pressing himself against the cold concrete. He could hear the shouts of their pursuers, getting closer. The figure beside him tensed, eyes darting around. Mark swallowed hard. Every sound was magnified. Every movement, every breath felt like it could give them away. They waited, in the suffocating silence, listening. Then, as the footsteps drew near, the figure motioned for Mark to follow. "Through the back," they whispered. Mark nodded, his hands clammy, his pulse racing. They crouched low, slipping past the dumpster and toward the back of a building. As they reached a rusty metal door, the figure hesitated. Mark could feel the weight of the moment. This was it. There was no turning back now. The figure pulled the door open, motioning for Mark to go inside. They both slipped into the darkness, the door creaking shut behind them. Inside, it was quiet, eerily so. The air smelled stale, thick with dust. Mark's eyes adjusted to the dim light, revealing what looked like an abandoned storage room. The figure closed the door behind them, leaning against it for a moment, catching their breath. Mark didn't know what to say. He felt numb, his mind struggling to keep up with the chaos that had unfolded. "Who were those people?" he finally asked, his voice hoarse. The figure didn't answer right away. They just stared at the door, as if waiting for someone to break through. "They're not just rioters," the figure finally said, voice tight with bitterness. Mark's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "They're part of it," the figure continued, eyes flickering with fear. "The ones pulling the strings. The riots, everything, it's all connected. They've been planning this for months." Mark's heart sank. The fear that had been simmering inside him bubbled to the surface. "What do they want?" he asked. The figure turned to him, their eyes filled with a grim kind of certainty. "Anarchy," they whispered. The word hung in the air, heavy and oppressive. Mark stared at the figure, his mind struggling to process what they had just said. Anarchy? What did that even mean in a city already on the edge of collapse? "They want to burn everything down," the figure continued, their voice shaking slightly. "Chaos is their weapon. If they control the chaos, they control everything." Mark took a slow breath, trying to steady his racing thoughts. "How do you know this?" The figure didn't answer right away. Instead, they paced the small room, their movements sharp and agitated. Finally, they stopped, turning to face Mark. "I was part of it," they said, voice barely above a whisper. Mark blinked. "What?" The figure looked away, their eyes distant, haunted. "I was one of them," they said, the words spilling out like poison. "I didn't know what I was getting into. I thought I was helping." Mark felt a chill run through him. He took a step back, trying to wrap his mind around the revelation. He began, but the figure cut him off. I was recruited, they explained quickly. They promised change, a better future. But now it's out of control. I can't stop it. I tried to walk away, but the figure's voice trailed off. Mark could see the regret in their eyes, the weight of their confession. You want to stop it? Mark asked quietly, his voice thick with suspicion and fear. The figure nodded, their hands trembling. That's why I'm here. That's why I found you. Mark felt a strange sense of confusion. Why me? Because you're not like the others. The figure said urgently. You've seen it. You know what's happening. Mark shook his head. He didn't understand. What do you need from me? The figure's eyes burned with intensity. We need to stop them before it spreads any further. Before they tear the city apart. Before they destroy everything. Mark's mind raced. The gravity of the situation was sinking in, and he couldn't ignore the fear gnawing at him. How do we even begin to stop them? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. The figure took a deep breath. We need to find the heart of it, the source of the chaos. Once we cut that off, the rest will fall apart. Mark's thoughts were scattered, his head spinning. Everything had spiraled so quickly. But how? How do we even find it? The figure's face hardened. We start by hitting them where it hurts. Mark felt a knot form in his stomach. What do you mean? The figure met his gaze. By taking out their leaders. The room fell silent, the weight of the figure's words sinking into Mark's chest. Taking out their leaders? The very thought was suffocating. Mark swallowed, his throat dry. You want us to kill them? The figure didn't flinch. Their gaze never wavered. Not kill, they said. Neutralize. We need to cut off their power, their control. Mark nodded slowly, though his mind raced. This was madness. But there was no time to second-guess. The city was already burning, the rioters pushing forward with unchecked rage. How do we even get close to them? Mark asked, his voice steady despite the doubt gnawing at him. The figure stepped closer, their eyes intense, calculating. We have to infiltrate. There are safe houses, hidden places where their leaders gather, plan their next move. Mark's heart skipped a beat. How do you know all of this? The figure hesitated, their gaze darkening. Because I've been there, they whispered. I've seen it firsthand. The confession hung in the air like a threat, and Mark felt a chill race down his spine. But we can't just walk in, the figure continued, shaking their head. Getting to them will take everything we have. It's a risk we have to take. Mark's mind raced, thinking of the destruction already underway. How much longer could the city survive? We do it together, he said finally, his voice firm. We find the leaders. We stop them. The figure nodded. Agreed. They moved quickly, gathering their few belongings. Mark felt a surge of adrenaline. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about taking back control. As they stepped back into the darkened streets, Mark's heart pounded. The sound of the distant rioting was still there, louder now, almost deafening. The night stretched on, but for the first time, Mark felt a sense of purpose. They had a mission, and they weren't going to stop until it was done. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. They would fight. They would bring the chaos to an end. The city seemed to pulse with life, its heartbeat fueled by fear and fire. Mark and the figure moved through the streets, silent shadows in the night. Every step felt heavier than the last. They had no map, no clear path, but they were driven by one singular goal: to stop the chaos. The closer they got to the heart of it, the more the city seemed to unravel. Buildings were half-burned, streets littered with debris and overturned cars. The rioters had taken over, their voices echoing in the dark, filling the streets with a maddening chant. We're getting close, the figure muttered. Mark barely nodded. The further they walked, the more the weight of what they were doing pressed down on him. This wasn't just a fight to survive anymore. This was a fight for the soul of the city. They reached an old warehouse at the edge of town, its windows dark and uninviting. The figure motioned for Mark to stop. "This is it," they whispered. "This is where it all started." Mark's heart raced as they crept inside. The air was stale, thick with dust and the scent of gasoline. They moved through the maze of old crates, the silence around them deafening. They knew they were being watched, but the stillness of the place felt unnatural, like the calm before a storm. And then they saw them, the leaders, gathered around a table, talking in hushed tones. Mark's blood ran cold. The figure squeezed Mark's shoulder, a signal to stay back. They waited. Their plan was simple, swift. But even in that moment, Mark could feel the tension crackling in the air. With a quick motion, the figure moved, taking out the guards one by one, silent and efficient. Mark followed their lead, his heart pounding in his chest. They reached the table. The leaders were unaware. And, in that instant, Mark realized this was their chance. They struck swiftly, ending the reign of terror in one decisive move. As the dust settled, Mark stood amidst the quiet ruins. The chaos had stopped. For now. But deep down, he knew the city would never be the same. The fight for its future had only just begun. And as they walked away, leaving the broken remnants of the old world behind, Mark looked at the figure by his side and knew they had done the impossible. They had brought an end to the anarchy.